Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Doubters of global warming may feel justified as snowstorms engulf many parts of China and hit the east coast of the United States once again. Beijing saw a record low temperature in 3 decades last week, and dozens were killed by the cold snap in usually a warm southern China, including Hong Kong. Heavy snowfalls might wreak havoc with the local transport conditions, but many may find new fun in the sweeping weather extremes. How will governments alert people to the volatility of extreme weather and provide due public service? Will low-carbon development help alleviate public concerns about climate change or other seasonal unpredictability in China and other parts of the world? Today, sitting in front of us are Mr. Wang Tao, Assistant Dean of the CBN Research Institute, and Mr. Ma Jun, Director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs. But before we get started, let's look at this footage.
How cold is a super cold snap? In Harbin, in northeast China's Heilongjiang province, temperatures drop to 30 degrees below zero. Penguins at the zoo fluff up their feathers to shake off the cold. In Xinjiang, close to China-Mongolia border, the lowest temperature went to -35. A small cat snuggles close to 2 sheep to keep warm. In the Dandong section of the Yalu River in northeast China's Liaoning province, large ice floes have appeared.
I haven't seen this for years. For like 10 years, ice floes become frozen in the morning and the sun at noon usually melts them.
Even seawater has frozen, trapping a dozen fishing boats along the coast in Laizhou Bay in East China's Shandong Peninsula. Local authorities have called off sea operations near the frozen areas. Traffic has also been affected. In central China's Anhui province, more than 1,000 cars were stranded on a national highway for hours due to icy road conditions. In southwest China's Yunnan province, snow and rainstorms caused traffic delays on several highways. The average temperature in South China's Guangdong province has fallen to below 10 degrees, with several places seeing sleet.
Welcome to our studio discussion here, gentlemen. Temperatures in Beijing plunged to between -15 and -20 degrees last week in Beijing, the coldest in almost 30 years, while the cold snap in Beijing is easing. Temperatures continue to fall in central and eastern regions of this country, with some experiencing record low temperatures. What are the reasons behind the extreme cold in China this winter, Ma Jun?
Yeah, last week I actually traveled to the southern city of Shenzhen for a meeting, and I did not even need to change my attire. The down jacket was suitable for that.
That was pretty rare.
Yeah, very rare, and the local people, including the taxi drivers, complained that they did not have the jacket for this, because for more than 10 years they never experienced such a cold weather. I think it has something to do. People, the experts, climate experts talk about the impact of El Nino effect, but they pointed that for this extremely cold weather, it has something to do with the extreme cold weather coming, the cold front coming from the Arctic Ocean and affecting North America and affecting the much of the East Asia as well.
Obviously, many people in the southern part of China have been caught unprepared for the severity of the winter. The cold front that comes from East Siberia all the way down this country. So, what's wrong with the weather patterns?
I think what we have heard many times from the climate change experts is that the ongoing climate change will increase one thing for sure, that is the pattern of the extreme weathers like this. So we may see more of this very cold weathers in the winter, as we saw in the last few years in North America, but this time in China, in Asia, but also sometimes extremely hot summers in other parts. So this may have something to do with climate change or El Nino, but I think it has to be carried out with more careful research by the climate scientists. But certainly this is something that they have been predicting for which would happen. I think we may not be able to link specific event to climate change, but there is overall increase in frequency of this type of climate change.
The point of my question, I'm afraid, is that many people are seriously concerned with the frequency of such extreme weather conditions? Are we going to have more of such extreme events in many parts of the world, particularly in warm parts of China? Either we have crippling heat waves, droughts, or in the winter we have the extremely cold snowstorms that pounded the east coast of the United States, for example. Meters of high, the snows meters deep. Although people did have fun with the snow, you can see many videos posted on the social media.
Yeah, those of us who sometimes read the historic data will understand there are extreme weathers in the past, and there are those natural variations of all this weather pattern. However, now what really worries people is that this human activities, which generate such a gigantic volume of greenhouse gases, will really change the, add in something, unimaginable into this climate pattern and make this extreme weather system a lot more common, a lot more frequent. This is something we call climate change. It's not just the warming, it's extreme weather system, and this will lead to a high cost. It's actually more about uncertainty. It doesn't mean it's good or bad. Sometimes it can be positive to some areas, but this is a huge uncertainties that will take all the humankind a huge effort to try to adapt to.
I agree. This is probably something you probably will see in a lot of predictions. That is, we are moving from rather stable climate patterns to something much unpredictable, and it could be something that may be quite strong in terms of disruption. And even the scientists will still have time to figure out what is the new pattern and how this is going to be a new equivalent for the climate. And that is actually going to lead to a lot of disruptions. People are unprepared because we didn't even know whether the existing climate model will still help us to understand what's going to happen in the future. And if we look at the history record in the last few years, you do notice this is an increased frequency of extreme weathers. And if I remember correctly, I think the 5 of the 10 hottest year in history, in record, are actually within the last decade. So you do see much higher frequencies of either very hot or very cold winters, or very hot summers or very cold winters happened quite recently. The pattern we see is like a summer, very hot summer per 100 years. Probably this time will happen maybe just per 2 decades or maybe 1 decade. So this is extreme weathers become more frequently, and also what is more important is the force also becomes stronger. So they also cause more damage and more disruptions to the society.
People around the world are scared by Hollywood blockbusters such as Tomorrow and the Year 2012, which painted a very dark picture about the weather changes, and people fled their homes. They were forced into a kind of extreme plight. Having said this, do you think we're going to face a breaking point or tipping point about, for example, ozone depletion that may have started from the early days of industrialization in Europe?
Yeah, there's still hot debate and discussion about this. There are those who firmly believe, most of the scientists firmly believe that climate change is happening, but there are still many skeptics who's holding a different view. And now the issue is about the risk. Are we going to, for the human society to be willing or be able to take such a big risk of a very, very unpredictable weather system, which is going to cause a much higher damage, as Mr. Wang put it. This is the question. Are we going to be willing to take that? Some said they are willing, but most of the people still think that we need to maintain a stable weather system, and to achieve that, we need to reduce the carbon emission and try to keep the global warming harnessed. The temperature should not be allowed to rise more than 2 degrees centigrade Celsius by the end of this century.
I think the threshold concept is quite important. As just Mr. Ma mentioned, we did agree that 2 degrees C temperature rise from the pre-industrial level is a very important critical level for us to not not exist in the future, and that is the ultimate goal that we agreed in Paris. But of course, there are some people and some countries are also arguing that we have to go to even lower temperature, for example, 1.5 degree temperature rise, which is more difficult to avoid. And some people may argue that we may never be able to achieve that. But the threshold is important because this is something like a level that you can push the system that much, but the system can still go back and have its own resilience. So we can still go back to the patterns that we are used to, we prepared for. But if you push that further, that means the existing system will have to be changed so dramatically, and they have to find a new equilibrium. They have to find a new stable position, which is nobody knows where it is, and we couldn't prepare for. So that is why we put 2 degrees C as a very high priorities for our climate change efforts.
Do you think a consensus has been reached during the Paris Climate Change Conference about starting low carbon development for developing countries in particular? Because this will be the most difficult part for developing countries which argue that we should adopt a common but differentiated approach.
Yeah, I should say that the Paris conference has been billed as a great success for the mankind in tackling a common threat. More than 190 countries have signed on that agreement. This is, I think, one of the first time, if not the very first time, for so many countries to decided to act together. Kyoto Protocol, when that got signed, most of the developing countries, or all of them, they were not part of this action. But this time, like Copenhagen, when the earlier meeting in Copenhagen, a lot of hope, but such a failure because of the debates you mentioned, developing country versus developed countries, whether we should take action together. But this time, I think all the people decided that let's take action together. We still observe this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, but no one should stand at the sidelines. We should all be part of this action. Some maybe need to do more, but all of us need to be part of the game.
Developing countries demand compensations. Do you think industrial nations will live up to the expectations when they themselves face so many difficulties, economic woes in particular?
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate requirement from the developing countries, because if you look at the contributions, the majority of the emissions and the greenhouse gases lead to today's status are done by the developed countries and by the industrialized countries. But I think there is also a dynamic picture that we have to look at, and you can also see that why China is having a rather more active and changing positions from Copenhagen to Paris, because we also start realizing that as one of the largest emitters in the world, we are also contributing more and more into the world atmosphere, and also that adds our responsibilities. If you think about historical emissions, that's true that developed countries still contribute most of that, majority of that. But if you look at the per average, which used to be a criteria that we used to ask developed countries to support more, China is now emitting per capita more than European Union. And if we continue with the previous trend, for example, like the last decades, we will soon even catch up with the historical contributions compared with America. So this is exactly why China needs to also take a lot of actions. And you see China is taking rather active attitudes, have the joint announcement with US, and also have a very active role in Paris. I think this is back to the Paris Agreement. I think it's a very successful starting point. People all get together, and different countries with various interests agree on something, then we are going to secure our future of the climate. But this is only a starting point because we only committed that target voluntarily. There is no penalty, there is no binding efforts to say what you have to be done. We do agree that we're going to review this every 3 or 5 years, but what would happen if we fail to perform, or if we realize that we have to do more? There may be another round of discussions, uncertainties about commitment. So China will continue to play a very constructive role there to show that we are responsible power to lead the, if you like, the bloc of developing countries to take a different pattern of the development.
Look at the impact of a hazardous fog in most major cities of China. I believe the general public have started to cultivate a burgeoning awareness about the consequences of environmental decline, and we vow to reduce our reliance on fossil fuel consumption. But what about other emerging markets like India, which vows to catch up with China in terms of GDP, and they say they benefit a lot from the labor dividends and so on and so forth. They are very optimistic and very confident in doing that, I'm afraid, like Brazil, South Africa, if not Russia, they will burn a lot more coal and oil to pollute the atmosphere. So I'm wondering if the BRICS economies will reach a consensus. How do they look at the agenda?
Yeah, I think for any of these BRIC countries, the emerging market countries, each one of us is having our own difficulties. And you mentioned about the other BRIC countries, they are facing their own challenges, like India is still trying to catching up. They're facing at the more initial period of industrialization. They want to burn more fossil fuel, they want industrialized. But for China, it's also not easy because we are burning half of the world's coal. Our economy is so much dependent on this fossil fuel consumption, and for China to make this this historic change, to make this transformation is hugely difficult. But you mentioned about the fog, the fog and smog, and this smog problem. I think this gives China a reason to make this no regret choice, because much of the sources of climate change and our local pollution, they come from the same source, and much of that has something to do with the coal consumption. So when we try to deal with our local air pollution problem, this have helped us to overcome such a huge barrier for the peaking of the coal consumption, and that leads to opens the whole possibility for the peaking of the carbon emission, and then the Sino-US climate deal, and then the Paris Agreement. I think all this has a lot to do with it.
But I'm not sure whether the free media in other developing countries like Brazil and India will buy your idea in times of trade protectionism, because they insisted that it is the industrialized nation, the developed countries, that should be held responsible and accountable for depletion of the ozone layer since the early days of industrialization. But you are watching Dialogue with Mr. Ma Jun and Mr. Wang Tao. We're discussing impact of climate change upon the severity of this winter. We'll be back in a short while. Welcome back. Wang Tao, it seems you have a lot more to say about India, our neighboring country and the most populous democracy. We keep our fingers crossed for the local media to supervise the behavior and consumption of the consumers about and the impact upon the environment. What can you tell us?
Yes, indeed. Thank you for reminding me about India, because I'm going to India immediately after the Chinese New Year, and the smog already worries me. So I'm sure that I will bring my mask with me. My colleagues actually showed me the picture of Delhi and Beijing. This contrasting, actually, even Delhi is even look much worse compared with Beijing, and people maybe are not so prepared for that. But I think what we also need to notice that if you think about the coal consumption in China, we and the CPN Research Institute, we launched a report together with IEA, International Energy Agency, about 2 weeks ago. You saw that all the major markets, the US, European, and Chinese market of the coal, are reducing in absolute terms last few years. And India is the only one with the increase, and increase over 2 digits. So that is